Flying over Vietnam was not a question of if an aircraft would be targeted, but when. Between 1965 and 1973, American military aviation operated under conditions that combined nearly every disadvantage an Air Force could face. The mission parameters were restrictive. The enemy air defense network was extensive. The aircraft, while capable, were designed for a different kind of war. And the pilots themselves flew into this environment not once, but repeatedly, often for more than 100 missions per tour. The fear they experienced was not irrational. It was the product of rational assessment. Every day the odds accumulated against them. The geography of Vietnam presented challenges that were immediately apparent to anyone who studied a map. North Vietnam was a narrow country, bordered by China to the north and Laos to the west. This meant that ingress and egress routes were limited. Pilots could not approach targets from unexpected directions. The terrain funneled aircraft into predictable flight paths, and the enemy knew this. They positioned their defenses accordingly. The Red River Valley, which contained Hanoi and the majority of strategic targets, was particularly constrained. Mountains rose on either side. Weather systems moved through the valley with regularity, creating cloud cover that obscured visibility but did not prevent missions from being flown. Pilots were required to navigate by instruments through weather that would have grounded civilian flights, descending through cloud layers to acquire targets visually, all while under fire. The missions themselves were tightly controlled. Rules of engagement imposed by political leadership in Washington dictated not only what could be struck, but how and when. Pilots were prohibited from attacking certain targets without explicit authorization. Airfields in North Vietnam could not be bombed if enemy aircraft were not present. Surface-to-air missile sites could not be struck while under construction. These restrictions gave the enemy time to prepare, to position defenses, and to learn the patterns of American operations. Pilots understood that their adversaries were studying them, noting their approach altitudes, their turn points, their egress routes. The Vietnamese integrated this intelligence into their defense networks with remarkable efficiency. American aircraft operating over Vietnam were not optimized for the missions they were assigned. The F-105 Thunderchief, which bore the majority of the strike workload in the early years, was designed as a nuclear strike aircraft. It was built to fly fast and low, deliver a single weapon, and return to base. Instead, it was tasked with carrying conventional bomb loads into heavily defended areas, flying repeated missions, and engaging in air-to-air combat when necessary. The aircraft was large and not particularly maneuverable at the speeds required for effective bomb delivery. It consumed fuel rapidly, which meant that pilots had limited loiter time over the target area. If a target could not be acquired on the first pass, options narrowed quickly. The F-4 Phantom, used by both the Air Force and the Navy, was more versatile, but it had been designed primarily as an interceptor. Early models lacked an internal gun, relying entirely on missiles for air-to-air engagements. This proved problematic in close combat situations where missiles were ineffective or unreliable. The Navy's aircraft carriers operated in the Gulf of Tonkin, launching strikes inland. Carrier-based operations introduced additional variables. Pilots had to manage fuel consumption carefully, knowing that they would need enough to return to the ship, locate it in potentially poor visibility, and execute a landing on a moving deck. Diverting to an alternate airfield was not always an option. If the carrier was their only recovery point and fuel ran low, the choices became stark. Weather over the Gulf was unpredictable. Tropical storms developed rapidly. Low cloud ceilings and poor visibility were common. Pilots launched into these conditions knowing that recovery might be more dangerous than the mission itself. The North Vietnamese air defense system was the most sophisticated that American pilots had faced since the Second World War. It was also the most integrated. Soviet advisors assisted in establishing a layered network that combined radar-guided surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft artillery, and interceptor aircraft. The SA-2 guideline missile, introduced in 1965, changed the nature of air operations immediately. The missile had an effective range of approximately 25 miles and could engage targets at altitudes up to 60,000 feet. This meant that no altitude was truly safe. Pilots who flew high to avoid anti-aircraft fire entered the engagement envelope of the SA-2. Those who flew low to avoid missiles exposed themselves to concentrated anti-aircraft fire. There was no altitude that eliminated risk. There was only a choice of which risk to accept. The SA-2 system required a radar installation to guide the missile to its target. These installations, known as SAM sites, were distributed throughout North Vietnam, with the heaviest concentrations around Hanoi and Haiphong. Each site could control multiple missiles and engage multiple targets. American pilots developed tactics to counter the SAM threat. They learned to recognize the radar's tracking signal through electronic warning receivers installed in their aircraft. When the receiver indicated that a missile had been launched, the pilot would wait, watching for the missile's smoke trail, and then execute a high G-turn at the last possible moment, hoping to cause the missile to overshoot. This maneuver was effective, but it was also physically exhausting and required precise timing. A pilot who turned too early gave the missile time to correct. A pilot who turned too late had no options remaining. Anti-aircraft artillery, known as AAA, was even more pervasive than the missile threat. The North Vietnamese deployed anti-aircraft guns in extraordinary numbers. Estimates suggest that by the late 1960s, more than 7,000 anti-aircraft guns were positioned throughout the country. These ranged from small-caliber automatic weapons to large-caliber guns capable of firing shells to altitudes above 20,000 feet. The guns were often positioned in clusters, creating intersecting fields of fire that were difficult to avoid. Pilots described flying through anti-aircraft fire as flying through a cloud of metal. The sky filled with black and gray bursts. Each burst represented a shell detonating, sending fragments outward in all directions. A single fragment could puncture a fuel tank, sever a hydraulic line, or destroy a control surface. The likelihood of being hit increased with every second spent in the target area. The tactics required to deliver bombs accurately kept aircraft within the anti-aircraft envelope for extended periods. Dive bombing, the most common technique, required the pilot to roll into a dive at a specific altitude, acquire the target visually, track it through the gun sight, and release the bombs at a predetermined point. This meant flying a predictable path for several seconds. Anti-aircraft gunners learned to anticipate these profiles. They would fire not at where the aircraft was, but where it would be. Pilots had no choice but to complete the attack run. Aborting meant wasting the mission. Completing it meant accepting the fire. The psychological weight of this exposure was cumulative. A pilot's first mission over North Vietnam was often described as terrifying but abstract. The danger was known intellectually but not yet felt. By the 10th mission, the abstraction had dissolved. Pilots had seen aircraft hit. They had seen parachutes deploy or fail to deploy. They had heard the radio calls from pilots whose aircraft were failing, whose controls were not responding, whose fuel was gone. They had watched friends eject over hostile territory and understood that capture was a real possibility. The North Vietnamese treated captured pilots as war criminals, not prisoners of war. Torture was routine. Information was extracted through prolonged physical and psychological abuse. Pilots knew this. The knowledge shaped every decision they made in the cockpit. Missions were not flown in isolation. They were part of a sustained campaign that required pilots to return to the same target areas repeatedly. A pilot might strike a bridge, watch it collapse, and then return 3 days later to strike the same bridge after it had been repaired. The repairs were often completed with remarkable speed. The North Vietnamese had organized labor battalions specifically for this purpose. Bridges, rail lines, and supply depots were reconstructed almost as quickly as they were destroyed. This created a cycle in which the same pilots flew the same routes to the same targets, knowing that the enemy had refined their defenses each time. The concept of a tour of duty provided a psychological endpoint. Air Force pilots were typically assigned 100 missions over North Vietnam. Navy pilots flew a similar number, depending on the length of their carrier's deployment. The number was fixed, which meant that a pilot could, in theory, count down. But the certainty of the endpoint did not reduce the danger of each individual mission. If anything, it intensified the anxiety. Pilots who were close to completing their tours knew that they had survived longer than probability suggested they should. They knew that each remaining mission carried the same risk as the first. There was no immunity conferred by experience. If anything, experience made the danger more vivid. Aircraft losses were a constant. In the early years of Operation Rolling Thunder, the sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam, loss rates were measured in aircraft per day, not per week or per month. On particularly intense days, a dozen aircraft might be lost. Some were shot down by missiles. Others were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. A few were lost to mechanical failure or operational accidents. The specific cause mattered less than the fact that the losses continued. Pilots did not need detailed statistics to understand the attrition rate. They simply counted the empty seats in the briefing room. electronic warfare became essential to survival. Dedicated aircraft were assigned to jam enemy radar and disrupt SAM guidance systems. These aircraft, typically modified versions of existing platforms, flew alongside strike packages, radiating electronic noise across the frequencies used by enemy radar. The jamming was partially effective. It degraded the enemy's ability to track individual aircraft, but it did not eliminate the threat. SAM operators adapted by firing missiles into the general vicinity of the jamming source, relying on proximity fuses to detonate the warhead when it passed near an aircraft. This meant that even with jamming support, the threat remained. Wild Weasel missions were developed specifically to suppress enemy air defenses. These missions used specially equipped F-105s and later F-4s to locate and destroy SAM sites. The aircraft carried anti-radiation missiles that homed in on the radar emissions from the SAM sites. The concept was sound, but the execution was dangerous. To provoke the SAM site into activating its radar, the Wild Weasel crew had to make themselves a target. They would fly into the engagement zone, wait for the radar to lock onto them, and then fire their missile before the SAM could be launched. If the timing was incorrect, the SAM launched first. Wild Weasel crews had some of the highest loss rates of any mission type. Weather was an additional adversary. The monsoon season brought low clouds, heavy rain, and poor visibility for months at a time. Missions were canceled due to weather. Targets still needed to be struck. Pilots flew through conditions that reduced visibility to mere hundreds of feet. They relied on radar to navigate, descending through cloud layers until they broke out into visual conditions, often at very low altitudes. If the cloud base was lower than expected, the breakout might occur too late for the pilot to pull out of a dive or avoid terrain. Controlled flight into terrain was a persistent risk. The enemy also used weather tactically. SAM sites and anti-aircraft positions were moved during periods of low visibility, making it difficult for American reconnaissance to maintain accurate intelligence on their locations. By the time the weather cleared and a strike package arrived, the defenses had shifted. Pilots found themselves engaging targets in areas where they expected limited resistance, only to encounter fully active SAM sites. Navigation over Vietnam required constant attention. The landscape lacked distinct features in many areas. River valleys, rice paddies, and jungle canopy all looked similar from altitude. Pilots used a combination of dead reckoning, radar fixes, and visual landmarks to maintain situational awareness. Errors were costly. Flying off course could take an aircraft over unplanned defenses or into Chinese airspace, which was forbidden. Airspace violations risked international incidents and were treated as serious failures. Fuel management was critical. Every mission was planned with specific fuel reserves calculated for the outbound flight, time over the target, and the return flight. Combat maneuvering consumed fuel rapidly. A pilot who had to evade multiple SAMs or engage in air-to-air combat might find that their fuel state was insufficient to return to base. Aerial refueling was available, but it required locating the tanker, which was typically orbiting in a designated area over Laos or the Gulf of Tonkin. If the tanker had already departed or if the pilot's aircraft was too damaged to safely refuel, options narrowed to ejection or attempting a landing at a forward airfield, if one was accessible. The physical strain of combat flying was significant. High-G maneuvers to evade missiles placed extreme stress on the body. Pilots experienced tunnel vision, loss of peripheral awareness, and in some cases, G-induced loss of consciousness. Anti-G suits helped, but they did not eliminate the effect. Repeatedly pulling high Gs over the course of a mission left pilots exhausted. The mental demand of managing the aircraft, navigating, monitoring threats, and executing the attack added to the fatigue. Missions over North Vietnam typically lasted several hours. By the time a pilot returned to base, they had been functioning at peak mental and physical capacity for an extended period. Maintenance crews worked continuously to keep aircraft mission ready. Battle damage was common. Aircraft returned with holes in wings, damaged control surfaces, and failed systems. Repairs were made quickly, often within hours, so that the aircraft could fly again the next day. The pace of operations left little time for thorough inspections. Maintenance was performed under time pressure, with the understanding that the aircraft needed to be available for the next mission. This occasionally resulted in mechanical failures that might have been prevented with more time. The enemy's interceptor force, though smaller than the American Air Armada, was effective within its operational parameters. North Vietnamese pilots flew MiG-17s, MiG-19s, and later MiG-21s. These aircraft were not technologically superior to American fighters, but they were flown by pilots who understood their limitations and used them effectively. MiG-17s, in particular, were highly maneuverable at low speeds and could outturn many American aircraft in a dogfight. North Vietnamese tactics emphasized hit-and-run attacks. MiGs would be vectored toward strike packages by ground-controlled radar, execute a single high-speed pass, and then disengage before American fighters could respond. This approach minimized their exposure while disrupting American formations. Air-to-air engagements were less common than ground fire as a cause of loss, but they added another layer of threat. A pilot focused on navigating to the target and avoiding SAMs had to remain alert for enemy fighters. The psychological burden of managing multiple simultaneous threats was considerable. There was no phase of a mission over North Vietnam where a pilot could relax. The return flight was not a release from danger. Damaged aircraft struggled to maintain altitude and airspeed. Pilots nursing crippled aircraft back toward friendly territory had to make continuous decisions about whether to continue or eject. Ejecting over North Vietnam meant capture. Ejecting over Laos offered a chance of rescue, but rescue missions were themselves dangerous and not always successful. Pilots weighed these factors while managing failing systems and dwindling fuel. Search and rescue operations were remarkably sophisticated, but they could not guarantee success. When a pilot ejected, they would activate an emergency radio beacon. Rescue aircraft, typically helicopters escorted by attack aircraft, would attempt to reach the downed pilot. The North Vietnamese understood this and would sometimes allow a pilot to land safely, then position forces around them to ambush the rescue attempt. Rescue crews faced ground fire and SAMs while attempting to hover in place long enough to recover a pilot. Many rescues succeeded, some did not. The certainty of return missions was perhaps the most difficult aspect psychologically. A pilot could not complete a mission and consider the danger past. The danger was ongoing. Tomorrow there would be another mission, the day after another. The accumulation of exposure wore on pilots in ways that were not immediately visible. Some became fatalistic. Others developed obsessive pre-flight routines, checking and rechecking systems, as if perfect preparation could guarantee survival. It could not. Flying over Vietnam required pilots to function in an environment where nearly every variable worked against them. The rules of engagement restricted their options. The geography funneled them into predictable paths. The defenses were extensive, integrated, and continuously improving. The aircraft had limitations, the weather was often hostile, and the missions continued, day after day, regardless of losses. The fear was not a failure of courage. It was a recognition of reality. The danger was measurable, observable, and unavoidable. Pilots understood the statistics. They understood the mechanisms by which aircraft were lost. They understood that skill and experience improved their chances but did not eliminate the risk. And they flew anyway, because the mission required it, because their orders required it, because their squadrons depended on it. The sustained nature of the air campaign over Vietnam created a unique psychological environment. There was no front line that moved. There was no decisive battle that would end the threat. There was only the continuation of operations, the repetition of exposure, and the knowledge that each mission carried the same fundamental dangers as the one before. This was why pilots feared flying over Vietnam. The fear was the product of experience, observation, and rational calculation. It was the understanding that survival was never guaranteed, and that the odds, over time, worked against them. Please subscribe to don't miss out on another great military story.